Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc.
I'm Sonia Jimmy, wishing you all a Happy New Year 2024. As we return to PEI from our holiday break, we're eager to embark on what promises to be an outstanding year, both for our Pods by PEI podcast and our overall initiatives.
In today's episode, we have PEI colleague Lasata Joshi in conversation with Raju Pandit on evaluating COP28 a Nepali perspective. Raju Pandit Chhetri is the Executive Director of Prakriti Resources Center, an environment and development organization based in Kathmandu. He has over 15 years of experience in climate change policy and sustainable development. Raju has followed UN climate change negotiations under the UNFCCC and Green Climate Fund for over a decade. He closely works with the government of Nepal and the least developed country group at the climate negotiations. He has written and contributed to several papers on climate change. Raju passionately advocates for ambitious climate actions and sustainable development. In this episode, Lasata and Raju dive into the pivotal themes and outcomes of the recent COP, recounting Raju's participation in this and multiple previous COPs. They explore the significance of COP Nepal and the real-life experience of Nepali delegates. They discuss recent critical shifts in the climate narrative on fossil fuels, proactive participation of major oil industries, global stocktake, loss and damage, and Nepal's push for the mountain agenda. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Namaste, this is Lasata Joshi.
Namaste, I'm Raju Pandit Chhetri.
Welcome to Pods by PEI, Raju.
Thank you very much.
Starting off, could you share what it is like to attend and participate at COP? Those who attend share it as one of the most hectic 2 weeks. As someone who has participated in COP for many years, how do you navigate this maze of events and track what's happening when you attend these meetings?
Well, the Conference of the Parties, or what we call a COP, happens every year. And every year, it's quite an interesting experience, given that different countries host it. And they have their own style of hosting it, given what the venue looks like and how big the conference that they would like to organize. This time, over 85,000 people attended COP28 in Dubai. Of course, it was held from 29th November to 12th December, and it extended by a day, given the complexities, politics, and trying to come to a conclusion at the end. So there was a lot of things happening at the COP. Now, when you talk about the Conference of Parties, it's basically under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We talk about how do you want to tackle the problem of climate change. But having said that, the COP venue is also a venue where a lot of practices, science, policies are discussed on the sidelines. So countries have pavilions. There are side events being hosted by the UNFCCC Secretariat to share experiences on the ground. So there are thousands of activities happening almost every day. So in order to really navigate that, if you're a first-timer, there are a lot of complications. You'll have to know what the agenda is for the day. You have to be familiar with the venue. You'll have to also know like what kind of people are attending, where do you belong to, where do you have to really go. Apart from that, also practical aspects like, where do you eat, where you're going to rest, where is your next meeting going to really happen. So there are a lot of things to navigate during the COP. However, for me, being in this process for quite some time, I've learned how to really do this work for myself, given my past experience.
It sounds like a lot of work on the ground. You mentioned that these events discuss issues of climate change. Why are these talks on climate change crucial?
Well, if you look at globally now, we all say that the climate change is the biggest threat to humankind, right? So in that particular context, we have no choice of not tackling climate change. And for a country like Nepal and for us, UN is the only forum where the multilateralism really takes place. That's the place where we go and share our thoughts, put our agenda. And this is also a place where about 198 countries globally come together to find a common solutions to climate change. We know that this is quite a complicated issue, given that this is just not an environmental issue, but is also related to socioeconomic aspect of the society. So it's quite a massive political challenge, I would say. because there are interest groups there. Developed countries have their own way of dealing things. Developing countries, they have a certain demand given what the UNFCCC or convention has really laid out, or the Paris Agreement that was agreed in 2015 laid out. So in order to implement that, this is the forum where all the countries can come together and find the solutions in tackling climate change, whether it be looking at it from a mitigation angle, adaptation angle, or providing resources and technology, and how we all debate to really come to a consensus where every country can go home and apply actions or policies so that they are contributing to tackling climate change.
So indeed, a must-have conversation of the moment. Now jumping into the COP28, which just concluded in December, it was a crucial year. The global temperature reached 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels, nearing the critical 1.5 degree mark in the Paris Agreement. The urgent need for rapid emissions reduction has remained a clarion call to avert this impending crisis. However, controversies surrounded this COP from the start. The host UAE, a top oil producer led by Sultan Al Jaber, CEO of a national oil company, sparked skepticism as he led discussions on fossil fuel phase-out. We also witnessed a staggering 400% surge in participation from oil companies and lobbyists compared to the previous year. What's your take on this climate narrative shift at COP28? Considering consecutive COPs have been hosted in petro-states and there is an increased oil representation, do you view this trend as a barrier or a catalyst for climate action, given the need for a significant transformation, particularly in the oil industry? Also, how do you perceive this proximity to major oil companies during this type of climate talks?
Of course, there was a lot of controversies, a lot of doubts and skepticism on how this incoming COP presidency, or let's say the UAE has a president of the COP, would take this COP forward, given that it's an oil-producing country and the country, whatever it's modernized, is built on oil money. There was a lot of skepticism for sure. But people also looked from a positive side that maybe an oil-producing country, if given responsibility, maybe they will have to, even for face-saving reasons, that they will be more ambitious in tackling climate change. We have been calling for phase out of the fossil fuel for a long time. But for a country like Nepal, where climate impacts are very huge, given melting glaciers in the Himalayas or having climate-induced disasters yearly, a lot of these impacts are growing over the years. It's just in Nepal, but also in similar countries like ours, in least developed countries, or now even in the developed countries where the climate disasters are growing. We know the real cause of this is the fossil fuel exploration and burning of the fossil fuel. That's what is creating the problem. But now when a country like UAE, that's the oil-producing country, hosts this, there was a lot of skepticism, as I said, but a good signal from the COP28 as an outcome. For the first time, it uses wordings like transitioning away from fossil fuel. This is a very big signal to the global explorer who rely on fossil fuel, who really sell and make money out of fossil fuel. Now, the global community will have to look into finding solutions to these fossil fuel and rely more on renewable energy. It has not only said that, but it has also reflected saying that we want to triple the renewable energy source. We want to double the energy efficiency. We want to provide technologies that really works in favor of renewable energy. So when you see what the outcome has really been, I would take this as a very mediocre outcome, not as a big win. However, a good signal for the international community, investors, private sector, to really say that tackling climate change and moving away from fossil fuel is a fundamental issue. Of course, how this will be translated into action is yet to be seen, but the signal seems positive for now.
Definitely, it was commendable that this COP managed to put conversation on fossil fuel on the table till the end, despite a few hiccups in between. Now, continuing on with the wins and misses of this year's COP, how far do you believe that this year's COP has contributed to advance in climate action since the conclusion of COP27 and Paris Agreement? And conversely, were there any notable shortcomings or areas where stronger actions or agreements were expected but perhaps fell short?
Well, in this COP, one of the major things that were to be discussed was what we call in technical term the global stocktake. In 2015, Paris Agreement was adopted and came into force in 2018. So in the last 5 years, what has been the achievement of taking a Paris Agreement into action was being reviewed. So 1.5 years of the technical review process, we clearly are not on track in meeting the 1.5 degree target that the Paris Agreement sets as an objective. Now, this was a very serious issue because when you look into the mitigation targets, the world's temperature is already rising by 1.1 degree, and the objective is to maintain 1.5 degree, and we only have a wind by 2030. So in that particular sense, we're expecting quite an ambitious outcome, given that they would definitely move away from the fossil fuel. In the past, we dived into how do you move away from coal. But for the first time, this COP has brought in the fossil fuel as an entire and transitioning away from that, really giving focus on the renewable energy technologies. Second thing was related to the loss and damage fund, because there were 5 meetings that took place in 2023 through a transitional committee that prepared how a loss and damage fund that was agreed last COP, in COP27, really would be set up. So in the very first day, the COP presidency was very smart to adopt this decision. So in that particular sense, it was a good win in going forward. Over $700 million were also placed to the fund. So this was a good trust-building exercise that took place at the very first day of the COP. But having said that, what we also wanted to see was these funds, this transitioning away from fossil fuel, we wanted that to be backed by the strong finance and technology support as well. Of course, that did not quite happen. There are a lot of mitigation and adaptation actions that has to be built. A country like Nepal has prepared something called Nationally Determined Contribution or National Adaptation Plans submitted to the UN FCC. But what it needs to be done? And these plans need to go into action. And we have said these plans are conditional. We will only implement that if the financial and technology support is given to us. But unfortunately, this COP was not in a position to really back that financing to say that we will support those actions prepared by a country like Nepal. So in that particular sense, expectations were not fully met, but largely there was a good signal that climate change needs to be tackled well, and also that the fossil fuel will have to end at some point of time.
Seems like there is a lot to unpack here, and a lot had happened at this year's COP. So let's start with global stocktake. As you mentioned earlier, this year's COP was centered around the culmination of the first ever global stocktake, which is a massive milestone in achieving the Paris Agreement and was the most contested draft during the negotiations, especially around the use of language and inaction around fossil fuel phase down. So much so that this COP had to overrun the official deadline by a day. As an expert on this topic, Raju, can you give our listeners a 101 on global stocktake and why it is essential?
Well, the design of the Paris Agreement was such that it would be the culmination of both top-down and bottom-up approach. So every country would provide the national commitment, what they would do in terms of reducing global greenhouse gas emission. And this would be reviewed every 5 years. So this was the design when the Paris Agreement was agreed. So in the last 5 years, the global stocktake was to see whether the implementation of the Paris Agreement was on track or not. If it was not on track, then we needed to do a course correction. So this helped us look backward and see what has been the achievement in its implementation. And what that revealed is we're not on track. We're not in track of meeting, let alone 1.5 degree, but we are in the track of 3 degree by the end of this century. So that's what the global stocktake really showed us. In terms of when your temperature goals are not being met, that means you have a massive investment you'll need to do in adaptation. Loss and damage cost is going to be extremely high as well. But then just knowing what the problem is not sufficient. So we needed to see what will be the forward-looking process now. So that's why we call this global stocktake backward-looking, but also guiding the forward-looking approach. So for this, the political decision had to be made. So this basically looked into the various issues about mitigation targets being met or not, adaptation actions being done or not, adequate finance was being mobilized for the developing countries to take climate actions or not. So all that was reviewed, and it came out that it was not on track. So now this has given an indication that this will have to work on in finance, mitigation, and so on and so forth. And it also talks very clearly that by 2030, 43% of the global greenhouse gas emission must be reduced. And by 2050, 60% must be reduced. Only then we'll be on track in meeting 1.5 degree by the end of this century. That is a very clear indication, because the objective of the Paris Agreement, if you look at, there is an objective on the mitigation on 1.5 degree. There is an objective on building a resilience and sustainable development. There's a objective on making financial flow consistent with low carbon and climate resilient development. So all these objectives has to be met, and this is given a signal that the global stocktake has given a very clear signal saying that, okay, this needs to move forward. We will see what their actions probably from the next year.
That was an excellent explanation on global stocktake. So we are not really on track for 1.5 degrees as according to Paris Agreement. But has this global stocktake provided a clear roadmap for policymakers?
Yes. Well, the global stocktake was a very, excellent approach of mirroring on what the implementation of the Paris Agreement was, and very clearly showed that if the globe is in track of meeting 1.5 degree or not, and it clearly showed it's not. So in that particular sense, it has given a very clear signal to say that all the developed and developing countries, the world is heading into 3-degree world. So in that particular sense, the kind of plans that has been put forward are significantly insufficient. So we need to ramp up our actions in terms of really cutting down our greenhouse gas emission. And what it has also said to all the parties is by the end of next year to provide the nationally determined contributions or long-term strategy in reducing greenhouse gas emission. Because the current plan is insufficient, so every country needs to really ramp up their ambition. So that has been a very clear signal. And not just that, this has to be backed by financial support, whether it's in the developed countries or supporting the developing countries in moving away and adopting a low carbon resilient development, that investing in that particular line is key. Whether it is the national budget that needs to align with the climate-friendly policies, or it is the developed countries supporting the developing countries to meet their nationally determined contributions that looks into the reduction of the greenhouse gas emission. So that clarity has been really given. Of course, now it is up to the countries to really accept that and take that plans forward. But I would also emphasize that it is just not the countries, but also is a very good signal to the multinational companies, especially coal or oil or fossil fuel companies who have been profiting out of selling this fossil fuel to them, that you don't have a long-term future. You need to divest from there. You need to move away from investing in fossil fuel and then invest in more renewable energy future.
And why was including action around fossil fuel important in this global stocktake?
In the global stocktake, the language on whether to phase out fossil fuel or phase down fossil fuel was a big debate. And this did not just start in COP28. It was already debated in COP26 in 2021. Since then, we wanted this to be phased out. A country like Nepal and small islands that have a very high climate vulnerability wanted to phase out fossil fuel. It means that there will be no longer investment into fossil fuel exploring or investing in building pipelines and things like that. But given the very strong lobby of the fossil fuel companies and others, that was not possible. Even coming to COP28, the language still continues to be transitioning away from fossil fuel, which means that you can reduce fossil fuel but not really stop using fossil fuel. So we still have a very dubious kind of outcome in a way to say we want to stop using fossil fuel, but then we just say it is phase down. Phase down literally means reducing of the using of the fossil fuel. But at some point of time, what we want is a clear action to phase out, which means we at some point of time, we have to stop using the fossil fuel.
Was there any clear roadmap on just transitioning away from fossil fuel? Like who transitions first? Is transitioning away from fossil fuel based on equity principle, common but differentiated responsibility? As there are many countries, especially developing ones, who rely mostly on coal for the economic benefit or economic development.
Well, if you look at the climate actions to be taken forward, it is very clear that the developed countries, those responsible for the cause of climate change, will have to take the leadership. That they will have to show to the world that first they are taking steps to move away from using fossil fuels. Whether it's for the energy usage or transportations or economic purpose, they have to take the leadership. Of course, developing countries can support in that action, provided that the developed countries are also supporting them with finance and technology. But now what we also can say is developing countries in recent decades are one of the highest emitters of greenhouse gas emission. They will also have to take into account that they also gradually start transitioning away from using fossil fuel. But for countries like LDCs and Cs who have very low capacity, poverty is still an issue. Many do not still have access to energy. For them, immediately moving away from fossil fuel would be quite difficult. So they might take longer time, but the leadership should definitely come from the developed countries and higher emitting, higher capacitated developing countries as well.
Hi there, this is Somit Rupani from Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. We hope you're enjoying Pods by PEI. As you know, creating this show takes a lot of time and resources, and we rely on the support of our community to keep things going. If you've been enjoying the show and would like to help us out, we'd really appreciate it if you could become a patron on Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows listeners like you to support creators like us with a small monthly donation. Your support will go a long way in helping us continue creating high-quality content for you. So if you're interested in supporting our show and becoming a part of our community, head on over to Patreon and become a patron today. You can find us at patreon.com/podsbypei. Every little bit helps, and we can't thank you enough for your support. Now let's get back to the episode.
Now moving on to loss and damage, which you mentioned was one of the biggest wins of this year's COP. This year, we saw numerous incidents of climate change-induced disaster in our neighborhood and throughout the world. So we need to recognize that countries did come together and that there's an agreement as historic as loss and damage and operationalization of loss and damage fund, which has been a long-standing call from vulnerable nations for at least 30 years. As someone who has worked for several years on this topic of loss and damage, how do you view the significance of this milestone, acknowledging the complexities surrounding fund allocation and distribution? And again, pressing on the roadmap, have we gained any clarity to whom, how, and when the fund will be operationalized?
Yes, at this COP, one of the major outcome was the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. It was agreed on the very first day. It was a very strong trust building and a very strong signal given to the world because the loss and damage issue was swept under the carpet for almost over 30 years. There was a very long, dedicated fights by the small island developing states and LDC countries in having this fund and this fund going forward. Climate-induced disasters are happening all around the world. It is just not an issue about developing countries or countries like Nepal. It's happening in the northern hemisphere as well. Like if you look at Europe or the US, everywhere it's happening. Because of the lack of appropriate or timely actions on climate change, the loss and damage is becoming inevitable now. It's, countries are having huge climate-induced disasters that is displacing thousands of people. People are having to migrate. There's both economic and non-economic losses. So in order to really address this COP has really made an effort to give a signal that we need to address loss and damage. And that's a good sign, particular of this COP. There was also, as I said, $700 million pledged to the fund. But this money is not going to come very soon. That's my understanding, that the mechanism will have to be set up. The fund board is yet to be set up. The fund secretariat is yet to be established. The policy procedures and on what basis the funds will be distributed, all those criteria are yet to be set up. So in that particular context, I would say it'll take a couple of years. And the money that is coming into this fund is only peanuts given the extent of problem that is globally being seen. So we will need hundreds of billions of dollars if you want to really tackle loss and damage. So just having over $700 million is only going to set up the fund, have policies in place, things like that. So in order to support countries, you'll have to massively scale up in raising more funds and having those policies and criteria in place as quickly as possible so the fund can really support country like Nepal. I know that really needs to show that it is just not about agreeing to a fund, but actually delivering funds so the people on the ground, the communities on the ground can feel the decision in COP28 was actually, in fact, for us. So that realization have to be given. That can only happen when the money actually flows to these countries and communities.
So what will happen in the meantime as the fund gets collected? This type of disaster would not stop. For example, what happens if incident like Melamchi flooding happens again? How does a country or the community rise up from these type of incidences?
Well, if you see in the last couple of years, Nepal has faced extreme climate-induced disasters. You saw the Melamchi case, we saw the Manang flood in 2021, and also this year in Mustang. So we can say that these are very much related to climate-induced disasters. But of course, country like ours will also have to work and to prove that this kind of events that are happening, the trend that is taking place is due to climate change. So it'll have to be backed by both science and also by social perspectives. Now, in order to do that, we'll have to work on scientific information, data, and so on and so forth. While that preparation is taking place, at the same time, loss and damage fund is also being in place. So as I said, it might take a couple of years to come from that particular fund. But of course, the communities cannot wait. Countries like ours cannot wait that the fund will get operationalized, all the money will come from there. No, that is not going to be sufficient. So Nepal or a country like ours will have to explore on what are the other avenues of funding. Because having a loss and damage fund is one thing, but that is not the only source. We'll have to see whether we can receive resources from Green Climate Fund or their adaptation fund or other multilateral and bilateral sources in order to support communities like in Melamchi or in Manang or in Mustang. Only that will actually help the communities on the ground. Otherwise, we'll be waiting for a very long time because this fund is, as I said, still very uncertain on how that will be coming and operationalizing in terms of actually delivering resources.
Now, moving away from loss and damage fund, but continuing on climate finance, fixing climate finance was one of the stated aims of COP28. How do you see the narrative surrounding climate finance evolving, notably when the pledged $100 billion per year in 2015 appears inadequate and hardly met?
Yes, this $100 billion per year goal was set up not just in 2015, but going back to 2009 when the Copenhagen Climate Summit took place. And then we talked about two fundings. One was what we call a fast start finance. For 3 years, 2010, 11, and 12, developed countries would give developing countries $10 billion per year. And that is the total for 3 years was $30 billion. And that resources would rise up all the way to $100 billion per year by 2020. So when it came to 2015, there was a decision that the $100 billion goal would be per year, would be from 2020 to 2025. But we have the report that the developed countries have not been able to meet their target of $100 billion per year. So there's a lot of exercise being done how to really realize this goal. And there's also a lot of frustrations among the developing countries that it was promised almost a decade ago, has not been materialized yet. So this is a very big issue for developing countries. This is the resource that many developing countries have prepared their NDCs or NAPs, thinking that the resources will come and will be able to take climate actions on the ground. When these resources are not being available, there's a lot of frustration. Of course, when the quantum has not been met, similarly, the access process has also been extremely difficult. So even if there's money, the money getting to the countries has been extremely complicated, complex, cumbersome, lengthy, difficult to understand. So there's a lot of effort. Now, how do you simplify this access process as well? So one of the outcome of the global stocktake was also looking into the finance, that how much has been delivered in last 5 years, and then whether the access of that money was really easy or not, looking at the qualitative side, not just on the quantitative front, but also looking at the qualitative side. So there is frustration, but developed countries have said that they are willing to meet their commitment. So one of the major thing in the COP issues always becomes a finance issue. And this is always dealt at the end because it also, interfaces with the other issues. So there's a process now agreed. While the attempt is to fulfill the 100 billion target, there's also an attempt next year that there will be a new goal being worked on and identified. So the countries will work on having a new goal from beyond 2025, like from the floor of 100 billion goal. What will be the another target that the developed countries will have to provide developing countries with climate finance. So that process is continuing, and I hope that there will be a decision next year.
Definitely, the pledging sounds promising. But how are these climate finance being channeled in developing countries? Various reports suggest that the nature of climate finance is mainly in form of loans and repurposing of development aid. What are its implications for countries already grappling with debt and vulnerable to extreme weather events, and those countries requiring such assistance in development?
Yes, when it comes to climate finance, there has always been controversy over whether the climate finance is additional to the official development assistance that the developed countries have been giving to developing countries or not. What I have said as a LDC country, Nepal and other countries have always said the climate change problem is an additional problem because we already have problem with poverty reduction, food security, other disasters like an earthquake and others, economic development, health, education, water, all these things has to be met. But because of climate change impacts, the problems are growing and this is being added to that problem. Hence, the finance that is being provided to developing countries, the climate finance also has to be additional to their resources. But unfortunately, what we have also seen from various reports are that a lot of the resources that the developed countries have been providing are not really additional to the development aid that is being given. So that is one of the major issues. The other issue that developing countries have been continuously raising is a lot of the assistance that is coming to developing countries is coming in the form of loans. While the countries are already indebted while they are doing their development, now countries are given debt, so they are further punished. On one hand, the climate impacts are growing. On the other hand, they have been overburdened by debt. So instead of debt, the developed countries should provide grants to the developing countries in tackling climate change. So that has been asked for a very long time. Nepal and LDC countries have continuously emphasized that we cannot be debt burdened now because our resources, instead of tackling and helping our people, we're having to pay back the principal and interest on the debt. So there's been a huge call how to move away from the MDBs to reforming them so that the more grants can be provided to countries like Nepal. But at the same time, also not double count with the development aid that has been provided for developing countries.
Now, going closer to home, Nepal did get a rare visibility this year at COP. For the first time, it had its own pavilion. The UN Secretary General visited the country just before the conference and highlighted the country's climate issue in global arena. Nepal also hosted a high-level segment chaired by the country's Prime Minister, which got some attention in the national media. What were the key points delivered in these segments? And where are we successful in gaining and retaining the attention at home and abroad? Moreover, were there any encouraging signs of progress or actionable steps stemming from this heightened visibility?
This year, Nepal did play and prepare quite well for COP28, given that there was several meetings being organized here in Kathmandu, where Prime Minister himself was giving quite a lot of interest in that. That's what it appeared, and a lot of the news came out in media as well. Just before the COP, UN Secretary General Guterres also visited Nepal. So that also put Nepal on the spotlight. And he very clearly, from the Everest Base Camp and the Annapurna Base Camp, he really clearly gave a message saying that how the climate change impacts were happening in the Himalayas. So that was very good for Nepal to highlight its case that the mountain was a serious issue. And for Nepal, this year, had a few things. One, of course, getting engaged into the negotiations, which is part of the process in the COP. The other one, also doing a lot of side events in its own pavilion. That was for the first time Nepal had a pavilion. Other than that, also showcasing and exchanging, sharing experiences by civil society organizations, indigenous people, youths, government agencies, and others in various platforms and forums. I think in that sense, it was quite an encouraging participation. But having said that, one of the very notable things that Nepal did this year was how to highlight and bring the agenda of mountains. There was a proposal, not by Nepal, by Andorra, like to have a mountain as an agenda to be discussed during the COP. Of course, that was not realized. But apart from that, Nepal did focus its activities around mountains. So Nepal's Prime Minister chaired and facilitated a high-level dialogue on mountain issues, where UN Secretary General participated, countries like Kyrgyzstan, Andorra, Bhutan participated. So it was a quite encouraging event. So because of the Nepal's encouragement and also way to take this mountain agenda forward, its alignment with Bhutan, Kyrgyzstan, and also Andorra, mountain issues has been, for the first time, really, in a way, come out very strongly in the global stocktake documents. Also in the global goal on adaptation, it has been mentioned. Now, one of the things what I would call as a good sign is it has been very clearly stated that in coming June, UNFCCC will organize an expert meeting on climate change and mountains. I think for this itself to happen and give that action point forward is quite a big win for Nepal. It's the first time this has been done. So probably now this is a win, but of course if you just sit back and do nothing, it may not happen much. But when the meeting is happening in June, Nepal will have to be proactive to say that this is what we want to present and the outcome of that meeting to be really reported during the COP and really taken from there. So our leadership will have to show a strong diplomatic and other form of leveraging in a way to say that this is our serious issue. We are confident that we can take this forward and use all the forums and opportunities to really move this agenda forward. So that has been quite a big win for Nepal.
What challenges do we face as a vulnerable nation to climate change in voicing our concern and issue in this massive arena?
There are quite a lot of challenges in furthering our interest in this climate change multilateral process, because sometimes we negotiate with our development partners. Sometimes going into those forums and really being harsh and negotiating is a tough thing. So usually what Nepal does in positioning itself is, rather than as an individual country furthering its interests, it aligns itself with the least developed countries group. So sometimes it's also easier for the country to work in a group. Otherwise, the preparation will have to be much more to deal individually. Of course, in the UN forum, every country can deal individually. But at the same time, Nepal does the work in alignment with the LDC's interest, because that's a common interest for all the LDC countries. But this time, the good thing is, though with that acknowledging that challenges on mountain issues, Nepal did go ahead individually. But there are also other countries like Bhutan, which is tried to align with. And I think it was a small group, but an effective work. But in order to really move our agenda strongly, the challenges that I see is the continuation of the negotiators going there regularly, because frequently we have changes in our negotiating teams. The second is, how do we, recalling the history, or let's say what has happened in the past, because when there's a frequent changes in the office, that also makes it quite difficult. And also the challenges that comes is when you frequently change people, is you're building relationships and networks with other countries, because for other countries there are people continuing in the process for many, many years. So it is very important that same people continue so that they know the history and also what they're looking for next time, they can prepare accordingly. So those are some of the challenges that I see for Nepal going forward. But of course, this is a process that we'll have to continuously engage.
So in the light of climate commitments and ongoing challenges, what were the main expectations or aspirations going into this year's COP event? Were there specific areas of focus or initiatives that stakeholders were particularly eager to address during this conference, aside from the mountain agenda?
Well, one of the major things that Nepal wanted to really, I think, take forward was, how do we have partnership and processes to implement our nationally determined contribution and the national adaptation plan? Nationally determined contributions, majority of the actions that is put there is related to the mitigation part. In that document, it has clearly laid out that by 2045, Nepal wants to achieve net zero emission. So there are certain sectors, like for instance, by 2030, Nepal wants to generate 15,000 of hydropower electricity. And 5,000 is unconditional, but another 10,000 is conditional, provided resources will do that. Similarly, there are also targets on transport, for instance. By 2030, Nepal wants to have the sale of electric vehicle to reach 90% private vehicles and public vehicles by 60%. We want to convert our cooking from gas to e-cooking. So there's been a target to have e-cooking, promote biogas and others as well. So we have very particular targets on how we want to move both in terms of production of renewable energy at the same time using renewable energy in the country. So that is a part of our mitigation action of going forward. We also say that by 2030 we want to have at least 200 kilometers of railway lines run by electricity. So I think that's some of the very good actions point that is put into the NDCs and submitted. But of course, we definitely lack resources in terms of implementing them. So one of the point going into this COP was also to talk to various development partners and international global climate funds where resources can be mobilized so that our NDCs and national adaptation plans can be really taken forward and implemented. But when you say that, there are two aspects. One, we look for resources and networking, and we do networking to have more partnerships, whether it's a public, private, all these things, and attracting them to invest in country like Nepal. But the other thing is also what we'll have to ensure is any resources that is coming into the country, are we utilizing that or not? Are we being able to absorb that in an efficient manner or not? Because there are projects, we agreed we have the resources, but our expenditure is also extremely low. I think that side also needs to be worked on. So just having plans and documents is not sufficient. But equally, what is important is when you have the resources, we need to also invest them on time so that the communities and the entire country can benefit.
Now that this year's COP has concluded, in your perspective, what would you identify as some of the pivotal takeaways for Nepal from COP28? How might these lessons influence and mold the nation's forthcoming climate strategies and policies?
Well, the outcome of COP28 will have to be looked from two different perspectives. One, a global perspective, one at the national perspective. So the global perspective would be like, as I said, in the GST, when it talks about tripling renewable energy investment or moving away from fossil fuel, transitioning away from fossil fuel, it means that Nepal will also have indirect benefit. So when the more mitigation actions are taking place, fossil fuel are not being used or explored, it means that we can meet the temperature goal, which literally will help us save our mountains, and that means less climate disasters and impacts of climate change. So that is a indirect benefit that we will have on that front. But having said that, we also have a direct benefit in terms of how we can advance our plans and strategies or whatever the programs that we have set. For instance, there have been funds being announced into Least Developed Countries Fund or Adaptation Fund or Green Climate Fund. We can make projects based on our NDCs and NAPs and really submit these projects to these funds so that more resources can come and then we invest in our communities. That is one thing. The other thing is, of course, Nepal is very rich in renewable energy. It means that tripling the renewable energy base means that we hope that there will be more resources also flowing in Nepal so that we can explore hydropower, solar power, and other form of renewable energy in the country. So that will also help us move economically. And the third part is that when you do more investment, potentially the amount of fossil fuel that we import primarily from India, we import about $2 billion of fossil fuel every year. So probably there will be less importing fossil fuel, and the money that goes in terms of dollars into buying fossil fuel can be invested in other climate change impacts like in disasters or in renewable energy or infrastructure, housing, health, education, and other forms. So I think those kind of benefits we can definitely see. But again, what I would say that these benefits don't come just by the global agreements. These actions only happens with our own initiatives, own way of working and really trying to see that our commitment is being met. We'll have to work towards meeting those goals.
Moving on, Raju, what can we anticipate on the road to Azerbaijan in COP29? What is installed for us? What must we work on to move from commitment to realizing the targets? Are there any significant meetings, activities, or agenda for the next year, for the next COP?
Well, COP28 had just ended, so we are just back from Dubai. Having said that, what I would say is the climate change action should not be from COP to COP. But there are a lot of things that we'll have to do nationally at home. And before I think about the next COP, I really want to see that whatever the commitments and opportunities that the outcome of COP28 gave, what effort do we make as a country in implementing that? How is the outcome of the COP28 going to impact our communities on the grounds that have been impacted by climate change, things in agriculture sector or in terms of renewable energy access, or it's managing climate change disasters, so on and so forth. So I think that actions of nationalizing or localizing the outcome of the COP is extremely important. So that would be my first priority. But having said that, of course, once we do these actions nationally, then we'll have a lot of things to take to 29 in Azerbaijan, so that our lot of experiences, a lot of difficulties that we face in accessing resources and implementing work, that experiences we can take, and really in the agenda item that is being shaped, we can help influence that, number one. Number two, we have said that mountain is a very key part, and we have really seen that this year for the first time the issue has been embedded into global stocktake, that we'll be able to build on that mountain issue and then really make much more stronger case in Azerbaijan. That will be the second part. And the third part is next year is expected to be a finance COP. It means that next year we will decide on a new number of what will be the finance that will be provided from the developed country to developing country, like the 100 billion goal. We'll have a new collective target next year. So that process will be there, and we'll be able to also contribute to that process to say that this is our need, both based on the quantity, but also on the qualitative side, that we'll be able to contribute to that debate and discourse.
Lots to do then. We feel that everything depends on the COP, but definitely much more goes beyond the COP. On this note, we have reached the end of today's episode. Thank you so much, Raju, for joining.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Lasata's conversation with Raju Pandit on evaluating COP28, a Nepali perspective. Today's episode was produced by Nirjan Rai with support from Kushi Hang, Ridesh Sapkota and me, Sonia Jimmy. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited by Ridesh Sapkota and Nirjan Rai. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakya from Jindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI, that's tweet followed by the number 2 and PEI, and on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pei.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Sonia. We'll see you soon in our next episode.